Well, State Parliament returned this week for the first time since the Liberal National Party's romping election victory. 51 new MPs were sworn in and a new Speaker elected. It was always going to be a triumphant sitting for the LNP and a difficult one for Labor. And the new government didn't miss the chance to take a swipe at the old one.
I don't think any Queensland government has failed to the point or to the extent that the previous Labor government that occupied this chamber failed. They left a legacy that will live in infamy for generations. But the other thing that they should apologise for is the election campaign.
An edifice of untruths, speculation and salaciousness was constructed in order to save a decrepit, desperate and dysfunctional government. And we will remind you every day of the disgrace of that campaign.
Well, the Deputy Premier Jeff Seeney and the Opposition Leader Anastacia Palashay join me now to discuss the week in Parliament. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Jess. Mr Seeney, that criticism we just saw that you levelled at Labor, does that fit in with Campbell Newman's promise on election night to lead a humble and dignified government?
Well, I think we will be a humble and dignified government, but I think it's the people of Queensland should never forget the extent to which the previous government failed. And those failings are even now coming to light as we get inside the records of the government and learn that the waste that the people of Queensland saw was only the tip of the iceberg. So the Parliament is a place where these things need to be aired, and the government took the opportunity this week to make sure that the opposition knew that their record was not going to be forgotten. Ms
Palashay, the opposition sat there quite quietly while those criticisms were being made. Does that mean you agree that Labor should apologise?
No, not at all. But what we clearly saw from the government this week was the worst week we've seen in Queensland Parliament. There was nothing humble, dignified or graceful about comments that were made. Now, the Premier set these high standards. He went to the election saying that's what they would be, and unfortunately the Deputy Premier sitting here tonight showed no signs of that whatsoever during any of the debate during Parliament yesterday or last night.
You're laughing, Mr Seeney.
Well, I was laughing at the opposition leader saying it was the worst week in Parliament that she's ever seen. It's certainly, being in opposition is a lot worse than being in government, and I think that's where Anastacia and her colleagues have to come. That's what they have to come to terms with, that they are now in opposition. But they have paid the price for the failing of a government that has failed, or that did fail, to the extent never before seen in Queensland's history, and we're not going to let them forget that, and the people of Queensland should never forget that.
At some point you have to govern, though, don't you?
Oh, of course we govern. Of course we govern, and we introduced a whole range of legislation. You know, that wasn't the only thing that we did in the Parliament. But the Parliament is a place of contest. The opposition try and attack the government. The other point I'd make, Jessica, of course, is that I've been in opposition for 14 years. I was never shown any mercy by Anastacia and her colleagues when she was had absolute power in the Parliament. So I wouldn't be human if I didn't return the favour now.
That's true, isn't it, Ms Palashay?
I've got tough skin, Jess, but what we saw, look, we do know there's a large, massive LNP majority, and we do know that they're using that majority to push through legislation, not sending it to the committee, and the Deputy Premier sitting here was on that committee that decided the changes for the Parliament. And what we saw last night was the Parliamentary Crime and Misconduct Committee. The chair was supposed to be chosen by the Leader of the Opposition, and previously had been chosen by the Leader of the Opposition, who's sitting here. And last night the Premier nominated his own person to be the chair. The Parliamentary Crime and Misconduct Committee is one of the most important committees of the Queensland Parliament. And what we saw last night was, I think, one of the worst weeks, and I think Queenslanders would be very upset to see the way that the Parliament was abused.
On the committees, one piece of legislation that was introduced this week was the cost of living bill, and that's not going to be scrutinised by a committee. How many other pieces of legislation are going to bypass that process, Mr Seeney?
Well, there's always a provision in the committee process for urgent bills, and the Labor Party seems surprised that we as a government are going to do what we said we were going to do. They seem surprised by the fact that we're going to keep our promises. We had a range of promises that we made to the people of Queensland during the election campaign. Now, we've got a right to implement them, not just a right, but a responsibility to implement them as quickly as possible. And that's what the legislation is doing.
Are there particular things, though, in that bill or other bills that the opposition does want to have a closer look look at?
We do, Jess, because today we've seen the, as part of the registration, the CTP component rises have occurred. Now, we think that perhaps this is a broken election promise already, because the LNP government won the election saying they were going to lower registration, freeze it, lower it by $15 to $20 a year, but now they're saying they're going to exclude the CTP component. This needs to be examined by the committee.
Labor fast-tracked and rushed through legislation too, though, didn't it?
Look, this was before we had the all-party system, the all-party committee system that decided that the Parliament needed to change. And the Deputy Premier sitting here tonight, he sat on that committee and he decided these changes. Now, Lawrence Springborg, the Health Minister, referred a health bill to the committee, and that health committee will bring it back to Parliament in a quick time frame by the 1st of June. This is exactly what could have happened with the cost of living bill. And we're not saying that we're not going to support the cost of living bill. We want to examine it, but it also allows closer scrutiny from people outside to have their say.
One of the issues that you raised during question time this week was about cuts to the public sector. How many jobs will go, Mr Seeney?
Well, we've said during the election campaign that the growth in the public service was unsustainable, and it clearly was. It was a big contributor towards that $85 billion worth of debt, which is the Labor Party's legacy to generations of Queenslanders. So it's impossible to put a number on where the final level of the public service will end up.
Give us a rough idea.
It has to be. No, well, I think that would be irresponsible. It has to be something that's sustainable. We are in a process of looking at what each of the departments is doing, looking at whether or not the outcomes that are being produced from the expenditure of that public money are justified, and that's responsible management. That's the sort of thing that a responsible government should do. We're doing exactly what we said we were going to do. We're implementing our policies, our promises one at a time, in a workmanlike, methodical manner, and the ALP, the Labor Party, find that that's a strange concept, but it's what we promised the people of Queensland we would do, and we will continue to do it, one promise at a time.
Is there fat to trim in the public service?
Well, my concern is that the then opposition went to the election saying that cost of living was a very big issue. Now, you can't pay the bills if you don't have a job, and we don't know how many jobs are going. So we asked questions to ministers during question time, wanting to know how many people they had in their departments and how many were frontline services. And can I say that no minister was across their brief? Not one minister knew the answer. Now, I know, as a former minister, that is one of the first briefs you get as an incoming minister. And for those ministers not to know, I don't know what they've been doing for the last 7 weeks. It was quite embarrassing.
That's an absolute nonsense, Jess. There's a provision in the Parliament for the opposition to ask questions on notice if they want numbers and data. Everybody knows that that's the provision in the Parliament, that if you want to ask a question like that, you put it on notice so that the numbers can be provided to you. Nobody expects any ministers to have that sort of data in their
Well,
heads.
it sounds like that question
it was a complete nonsense, and it indicated the lack of experience of the opposition. It's no good whinging about your officers, no good whinging about the deal you're getting, no good whinging about the fact you're on the wrong side of the Parliament. You've got to get on with the job, and that's the bit of advice that I give to Anastacia.
You haven't heard me whinging, but let's just say that it was a government that was out of touch, that weren't across their issues, and let's hope that they're better prepared next time, because those questions are going to keep coming thick and fast. Maybe you can have one next time, Jeff.
Anastacia Palashay.
I'd be pleased you'd ask me a question.
And Jeff Seeney, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess.